If you walked into a freezing conference room in Washington on January 21st, 1968, you would have seen something the history books don't talk about. 4 hydrogen bombs scattered across the Arctic ice like broken toys. Plutonium dust glowing faintly against the white snow. And American generals writing checks they couldn't cash to keep the Danish government quiet. We think the Cold War was about ideology and missiles and speeches at the Berlin Wall. That's the story they tell in textbooks. But here's the truth. The Cold War wasn't fought with tanks. It was fought with lease agreements. It was fought with defense contracts and mining rights and secret clauses buried in treaties that nobody read. Greenland wasn't a shield against communism. It was collateral. It was the largest piece of leveraged real estate in human history, and the loan is still outstanding. Let me show you what the ledger really says. Let me show you how America bought an entire country without ever signing the deed. And let me show you why that unsigned contract might be the most dangerous financial instrument ever created. Because when empires go shopping, they don't pay in cash. They pay in sovereignty. And the bill always comes due. In 1946, Greenland looked like power itself. It stretched across 836,000 square miles of ice and rock. It was 3 times the size of Texas. It dominated every map of the Northern Hemisphere like a white crown. Danish flags flew over tiny settlements clinging to the coastline. Fishermen pulled cod from the fjords. Hunters tracked seals across the frozen bays. It was the last vestige of a colonial empire that once stretched across the Atlantic. Denmark had lost Norway to Sweden. They had sold the Virgin Islands to America for $25 million in gold. But they still had Greenland. They still had the ice. And ice in the winter of 1946 was the most valuable asset on Earth. Harry Truman understood this better than anyone. He stared at maps with the intensity of a loan officer reviewing a failing mortgage. He knew what his generals knew. He knew what the newly formed Joint Chiefs of Staff whispered in classified briefings. If the Soviet Union decided to attack the United States, the bombers would fly over the North Pole. It was the shortest route. It was basic geometry. Draw a line from Moscow to New York on a globe, and it curves directly over Greenland. The island wasn't just strategically important. It was the highway of the apocalypse, and Truman wanted to own the toll booth. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Denmark was broke. The Nazi occupation had gutted the Danish economy like a foreclosed factory. The treasury was empty. The currency was weak. Infrastructure crumbled under the weight of deferred maintenance. People burned peat for heat because coal was too expensive. The government in Copenhagen was surviving on Marshall Plan dollars. They were living on American credit. And Truman knew the first rule of lending. When your debtor is desperate, you don't offer charity. You offer a transaction. So in December 1946, Secretary of State James Burns walked into the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, carrying a briefcase. Inside that briefcase was an offer that would reshape the map of the world. He sat across from Danish Foreign Minister Gustav Rasmussen. The room smelled of leather and cigar smoke and money. Burns was a former Supreme Court justice. He was a man who understood contracts and leverage and closing deals. He laid out the American position with the precision of a bankruptcy lawyer. Denmark was drowning in debt. Greenland was a financial anchor dragging them deeper. It cost millions to administer. It produced almost nothing except fish and cryolite. Why should a broken country burden itself with a frozen continent? Then he dropped the number, $100 million, in gold, payable immediately from the vaults of Fort Knox. Rasmussen went pale. That money could rebuild Copenhagen. It could finance modern hospitals and schools and factories. It could jumpstart an entire economy. It was more than Denmark's entire national budget. For a moment, the temptation must have been crushing. The spreadsheet said sell. The accountants would have screamed yes. But Rasmussen understood something Burns didn't. Nations are not corporations. They cannot liquidate their identity and walk away clean. The economic trap was already sprung. Denmark didn't just owe money to banks. They owed their sovereignty to geography. The Soviet Union sat like a bear on their doorstep. The Red Army occupied eastern Germany. Soviet submarines prowled the Baltic Sea. If Denmark sold Greenland to America, Stalin would see it as betrayal. He would see it as Denmark joining the enemy camp, and he might decide to collect his own debt. He might invade Denmark to secure the Baltic exit. Rasmussen was caught between two creditors. The Americans wanted the island. The Soviets wanted obedience. And Denmark had nothing to negotiate with except time. So the negotiations dragged on in secret. Months turned into years. The Americans kept pushing. The Pentagon drew up plans for massive air bases. They sketched maps where Greenland was colored the same blue as the continental United States. They even discussed naming conventions. Would it be the state of Greenland, the territory of the North, the Arctic Commonwealth? But while diplomats argued in hotel suites, the military was already moving in. They didn't wait for a signed deed. They just started building. In 1951, the trap closed. Denmark signed the Defense of Greenland Agreement. It was a masterpiece of unequal exchange. The treaty gave the United States the right to build and maintain military bases anywhere on the island. It gave them jurisdiction over American personnel. It gave them control of the airspace. It gave them permanent occupancy with no rent and no expiration date. Denmark kept the flag. America kept the power. It was a foreclosure disguised as a partnership. Sovereignty is solvency, and Denmark was insolvent. The smoking gun was buried in Article 7 of the treaty. It stated that the United States could establish defense areas without prior consultation. Translation: America could take any piece of land they wanted, and Denmark couldn't say no. It was a blank check written on Danish sovereignty, and the Pentagon cashed it immediately. In the far north of Greenland, at a place called Thule, construction began. They called it Project Blue Jay. It was one of the largest engineering projects in Arctic history. Thousands of workers, millions of tons of steel and concrete. A runway 10,000 feet long carved into the permafrost. The base could handle B-36 Peacemaker bombers. These were monsters of the sky. 6 propeller engines and 4 jet engines. Range 10,000 miles. Payload: nuclear weapons. From Thule, a bomber could reach Moscow and return without refueling. It was the dagger at Stalin's throat. But there was a cost buried in the budget. A cost measured in human displacement and broken promises. In May 1953, the American commanders needed to expand the base perimeter. They looked at the map and saw a problem. A local Inuit community lived on the land. They had lived there for centuries. They hunted seals and narwhals in the ice fjords. Their ancestors were buried in the frozen ground. The Americans told the Danes the locals had to go, and Denmark, terrified of angering their protector, gave the order. The Inuit were given 4 days to pack their sleds, 4 days to abandon their homes and their hunting grounds and their ancestral graves. They walked north on the ice into the biting wind. Women carried infants wrapped in sealskin. Old men stumbled through snowdrifts. They walked nearly 100 miles to a new settlement called GIUK. They lived in tents on the ice while they built new sod houses. It was a forced march that shattered an entire community. For decades, the Danish government called it a voluntary relocation. It was a lie. The truth was buried in classified documents and sealed testimony. The eviction of Thule was the down payment on America's Arctic empire. The Inuit paid the price. Denmark signed the check, and America took possession. It was a theft, but it was a legal theft. The kind that happens when powerful creditors rewrite the terms of a loan. While the diplomats smiled for cameras, the real work happened underground. In 1959, the U.S. Army launched Project Iceworm. Publicly, they told Denmark they were building a research station called Camp Century. They said they were testing construction techniques in extreme cold. They built a city beneath the glacier. Massive trenches cut into the ice. Steel arches covered with snow. Inside the tunnels, they built barracks and dining halls and a movie theater and a chapel. They even installed a portable nuclear reactor to power the lights. It looked like science fiction. It was marketed as peaceful research. But it was a lie wrapped in secrecy and buried under 1 million tons of ice. The real purpose of Camp Century was military. The Army wanted to deploy 600 nuclear missiles beneath the Greenland ice sheet. They planned to build 2,500 miles of tunnels. The missiles would be mounted on trains constantly moving through the ice, so Soviet satellites could never target them. It was the ultimate stealth weapon. A nuclear arsenal that could vanish into the glacier and emerge anywhere to strike. The cost was staggering, the engineering was insane. The deception was total. Denmark had a strict policy against nuclear weapons on Danish soil. The Americans violated that policy every single day. They built a nuclear launch pad in the ice without telling their landlord. Sovereignty is solvency, and Denmark had sold theirs for security guarantees. Project Iceworm collapsed under its own weight. Literally, the glacier moved faster than the engineers predicted. The ice sheet is not static. It flows like frozen honey. The tunnels warped and buckled. The steel arches twisted. The nuclear reactor had to be evacuated. The base was abandoned in 1967. They left everything behind: diesel fuel, chemical waste, low-level radioactive material. All of it buried in the ice. They assumed the glacier would entomb it forever. They assumed the ice would never melt. They were wrong. The climax came on January 21, 1968. A B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs caught fire over Baffin Bay. The crew ejected. The plane crashed onto the frozen sea near Thule. The conventional explosives in the bombs detonated on impact. They didn't cause a nuclear explosion, but they shattered the plutonium cores. Radioactive particles scattered across the ice like glowing sand. It was a disaster that could have ended the world. The United States and Denmark launched a desperate cleanup operation. They called it Project Crested Ice. Hundreds of workers in protective suits scraped radioactive snow into barrels. They worked in 20 below zero temperatures. They loaded contaminated ice onto ships and sent it back to America. The cost was never disclosed. The full extent of the contamination was classified. But the accident revealed the truth. The United States had been flying nuclear weapons over Greenland for years. They had been violating Danish airspace with hydrogen bombs, and Denmark had known. Or at least certain people in Copenhagen had known. It was a scandal that shook the government. Protests erupted in the streets. The Prime Minister's approval ratings collapsed. But the alliance held, because Denmark had no choice. They were too deep in debt, not financial debt, strategic debt. They owed their survival to American protection, and creditors don't forgive debts. They just restructure the terms. The generational aftermath is still unfolding. The ice is melting. Climate change is opening the Arctic faster than anyone predicted. The northern sea routes are becoming navigable. The resources buried under Greenland are being exposed. Rare earth minerals, uranium, gold, zinc, rubies. The island is not just a military asset anymore. It is a treasure chest. And everyone wants a key. China calls itself a near-Arctic nation, despite having no Arctic coastline. They want to build a polar Silk Road. In 2018, a Chinese state-owned company offered to build 3 international airports in Greenland. The cost was $500 million. It was pocket change for Beijing, but it would have given China control over Greenland's air traffic. It would have given them a foothold in the Arctic. The reaction in Washington was panic. The Pentagon saw it as a strategic invasion. They pressured Denmark to block the deal. And Denmark, once again caught between creditors, used their veto power. They killed the Chinese offer. Then they offered to finance the airports themselves. It was checkbook diplomacy. Denmark spent money they didn't want to spend to keep China out, all because America demanded it. The leverage from 1946 is still paying dividends in 2024. Then came August 2019. Donald Trump revived Harry Truman's ghost. He reportedly asked his advisors to explore purchasing Greenland. The media laughed. Late-night comedians made jokes. The Danish Prime Minister called it absurd. But the generals weren't laughing. They had briefed the president on the rare earth deposits. They had briefed him on Chinese infrastructure projects. They knew that buying the island was logical. It was clumsy. It was politically impossible. But it was strategically sound. The offer was rejected publicly and sharply. But behind the scenes, something shifted. The United States opened a consulate in GIUK for the first time in decades. They sent millions in aid. They started courting Greenlandic politicians. The check was rejected, but the engagement began. America realized they had been neglecting their most valuable collateral, and they started paying more attention to the fine print. Today, the people of Greenland are watching this game with exhausted eyes. They know they are the prize. They know they are sitting on trillions of dollars in resources. They want independence from Denmark, but independence costs money. Right now, Denmark sends Greenland a block grant that covers half their public budget. Without that money, the schools close. The hospitals shut down. The government collapses. So Greenland faces an impossible choice. Do they sell mining rights to China and risk American retaliation? Do they accept deeper American military presence and become a target in the next war? Or do they stay with Denmark and remain a semi-colony forever? It is the same trap their ancestors faced in 1953. except now they have a voice. They have a parliament, and in 2021 they used it. A massive mining project at Quanner was up for approval. The site contains the world's largest rare earth deposit, but it also contains uranium. The election became a referendum on sovereignty versus environment. The anti-mining party won. They blocked the project. It was a rare moment of self-determination. But the pressure hasn't stopped. It has only increased. Because the ledger doesn't care about elections. The ledger cares about assets and liabilities. And Greenland is the largest unclaimed asset left on Earth. The Cold War never ended in Greenland. It just went into hibernation. And now, as the ice melts, the old conflicts are thawing out. The GIUK Gap is active again. Russian submarines probe the underwater cables that carry 90% of global internet traffic. Chinese research vessels map the seafloor. American P-8 Poseidon aircraft patrol the skies. The base at Thule has been upgraded with new radar systems that track satellites and missiles. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. New shipping lanes are opening. New resources are being discovered. And Greenland sits in the center of it all. The island that Harry Truman tried to buy for $100 million is now worth trillions. If he had succeeded, it would have been the greatest investment in American history. It would have made the Louisiana Purchase look like a bad deal. But because the sale never happened, we are left with a legal ghost. A treaty that gives America all the benefits of ownership without the responsibilities. A relationship built on leverage and fear and unspoken threats. Denmark still flies the flag, but the power beneath it is red, white, and blue. The United States is buying Greenland inch by inch, contract by contract, defense upgrade by defense upgrade, mining investment by mining investment. They are not writing a check. They are writing 1,000 small checks. And one day we will look back and realize the sale went through after all, just without the paperwork. Sovereignty is solvency, and Greenland has been insolvent since 1951. The debt was never paid. It was refinanced. And the interest keeps compounding. The Inuit who were evicted from Thule still wait for justice. The plutonium scattered across the ice in 1968 is still buried in the glacier. The nuclear waste from Camp Century is slowly being released as the ice melts. These are the hidden liabilities, the toxic assets buried in the balance sheet, and they are coming due. This is the most dangerous real estate deal in history, not because it was violent, not because it was illegal, but because it was never finalized. It exists in a legal gray zone where treaties replace titles and influence replaces ownership. It is a deal built on melting ice and shifting alliances and unspoken understandings. And when the ice is gone, when the Arctic Ocean is navigable year-round, when the resources are finally accessible, the question will return. Who owns Greenland? Denmark, who holds the deed? America, who built the bases? China, who wants to buy in? Or the 56,000 Greenlanders who actually live there? The ledger doesn't have an answer yet, but it will. Because in the end, history is not decided by flags or speeches or ideals. It is decided by accountants and debt and leverage. It is decided by who controls the collateral when the loan comes due. Subscribe now if you want to stay ahead of the curve, because when the glaciers finish melting and the final invoice is written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. This is how empires are built. not with declarations of war, but with unsigned contracts and strategic patience. The takeover is happening every day, and nobody is writing it down except us.